I want to talk with you about some really common ways of thinking that are probably driving your anxiety. And at the end, we'll talk about an effective way to reduce your anxiety by recognizing what your mind is up to. Because a lot of our anxiety comes from our thoughts, especially the way we think about the future and about the unknown. Because when there's some outcome that we care about in the future, and we don't know how it's going to turn out, like, am I going to stay healthy? Am I going to get that job that I want? Then our minds try to fill in the gap. And a lot of time, what they fill those gaps in with are negative stories, bad outcomes. We don't get the job, our health falls apart. And kind of ironically, that's because our minds are trying to protect us. They're trying to help us to spot danger in advance so that we can take care of it, so we can avoid it. But most of those scary stories are false. They're what we call a thinking error. It's also known as a cognitive distortion. It just means that information comes into our minds. We do some kind of processing of that information, and then our brains spit out something that's not quite accurate. Now, there are a lot of these thinking errors. There are whole lists of them. I'll include a link in the description below where you can find a list of common thinking errors. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on the top 5 that I see that contribute to our anxiety. All right, number 5, overgeneralization. So this is where we take information that's relevant in one situation and we apply it in another situation where it's not really applicable. So let's say I have a concern with my health, like maybe I've got a cut on my finger and I'm worried that maybe it's going to turn into an infection. So I go online and I read about other people who've had cuts that might be like mine and what happened. And I find out about someone whose cut got infected and it turned into a pretty bad situation. So if I assume that that outcome applies to my situation, then I might be ignoring lots of things that are different about our situations. Because what happened to someone else or what happened to me in the past might not really be relevant. So that's overgeneralization. All right, number 4, emotional reasoning. So I was getting on a plane one time. I'd been away from my wife and kids. I was going back home. And as I was about to board, I just had this really bad feeling. I felt like something's going to go wrong, the plane is going to crash or something. And I thought, maybe I shouldn't get on this flight. But I did. I got on it anyway. I knew the statistics about flying. I figured it was probably okay. Obviously, things went all right. Here I am. And that's because our feelings so often aren't good predictors of what's going to happen, especially if we're prone to anxiety. Because we're going to be having anxious feelings a lot of the time that really aren't informative in terms of the facts about what's actually going to happen on the ground. Now, you can probably think of a situation where someone had a gut feeling, an intuition about something. They listened to it, like they didn't go to work that day or something, and they avoided a really bad situation. And that happens sometimes. But if we assume that those types of rare cases always apply, then we're back to overgeneralizing. Because most of the time, our anxious feelings are probably not telling us anything true. And that brings us to number 3, which is mind reading. So this happens a lot in social anxiety. So let's say I'm giving a talk and I'm not really sure how it's going. And I look around and I start to imagine that I know what people are thinking about how I'm doing. I think, oh, that person is thinking like he sounds stupid, or that person is thinking like this person is so boring. But really, we don't know what's going through other people's minds. Maybe they're thinking, I wonder what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. Or they're enjoying the talk, or they're thinking about anything else. But when we assume that we know the bad things other people are thinking, then we're going to tend to feel worried and anxious. Number 2, catastrophizing. And I see this one all the time. This is where we take something that might be a little bit bad and we turn it into a worst-case scenario. So going back to that scenario where if I had a cut on my finger and I'm imagining something bad happening, maybe it does get a little infected. Maybe it turns red, it's a little swollen. So my mind might jump to, and now it's going to get so infected that I'm going to end up in the hospital. Maybe my finger will have to be amputated. Maybe I'm going to develop an awful case of sepsis. And all those things are just fantasies the mind is creating. Most of the time, our worst case scenarios don't happen. And this can happen with anything. Like maybe our partner is late coming home and our mind jumps to, well, they've been in a terrible accident. Most of the time, this is going to be a thinking error because usually our worst case scenarios, thankfully, don't happen. And that brings us to number 1, fortune telling. So this is the most common thinking error that I see behind anxiety. And really, this is what anxious thoughts are all about. It's thinking that we somehow can see ahead and know the future and know bad things that are going to happen. Like maybe we have some uncertainty around our money situation and we think, I'm going to be ruined financially. And without realizing it, we're acting like we have a crystal ball to see the future. So how can we deal with these ways of thinking? So step 1 is to recognize them. Recognize what the mind is up to. Know when it's telling a story that may not be true. And with practice, we can get better at seeing the stories the mind is creating. Next, label it. So we can say, that's catastrophizing. That's fortune telling. And just giving it a name can take the edge off of that thought and help us to have a better perspective and be able to see through those thinking errors. And finally, see if it comes true. Develop a practice of recognizing when the mind was wrong. Because the more we can recognize these thinking errors, the easier it is to see through them and to start to get some relief from that anxiety. And over time, you'll probably find out that most of these ways of thinking are false. That's why they're called thinking errors, because most of the time, they're not accurate. So I encourage you to start to develop the practice of recognizing your own thinking errors. Let me know how it goes. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll see you next time.